Okay, we are trying to talk today a little bit about the impact of cover crops on phosphorus loss with runoff in conservative rotation managed with no-till or tillage. We need to pay attention about water quality and the environment. We have had increasing public sensitivity about nitrogen and phosphorus water pollution from agriculture. It doesn't matter who's right or the cause, we all are being watched and scrutinized. And I don't think it matters who sits in the White House or here in Des Moines in the governor's chair, but I expect that in the future there will be just not less regulation, but more and more strict enforcement. So we need to carefully consider management impacts on the profitability of crop production, of course, but also soil health and water quality, and some practical issues when implementing conservation practices. See, there are a few things that we know that should do, in order to get the best phosphorus levels or fertilization for crops, for an economic crop production. So we need to know what are the optimal soil test levels. We need to use cost-effective application rates for deficient roads, soils, and we need to look at phosphorus removal with harvest to maintain the soil test that we want to maintain over time. We also need to recognize within field variation in soil test phosphorus, yield, and peat removal. And I believe that it's a must today for every farmer out there to use yield monitors, good soil sampling and testing, and variable rate application technology. We cannot continue working fields for the average as we used to. We need to use the manure nitrogen resource carefully, because in many conditions, by applying a manure rate that supplies the nitrogen needed by corn, we may be applying the right amount of phosphorus for a couple of crops, or we may be applying too much. So there, especially with poultry manure. So there could be, soil buildup over time, and that could result in large phosphorus losses and water quality impairment. Now, I'm not going to talk about this today, but subsurface banding or injection of fertilizers or manure phosphorus isn't better than broadcast for yield, even for no-till. Artisan started sometimes, but could help put that phosphorus below the surface in terms of the water quality. Okay, I have shown this many times, and I don't want to show much details. The soil test is one of the issues. A large proportion of the farmer fields out there, not just the ones that apply manure, have a soil test phosphorus values higher than optimal for crops. So here are our interpretation classes, very low, low, optimal, high, very high for corn and soybean, and many farmers could save money and reduce the risk of phosphorus loss by just doing the right thing in terms of not applying phosphorus just in case. This is something I prepared 3 years ago. We have three scenarios here: great practices, great prices here on the left, that they were 4, 5, 6 years ago. And then we have the center and the right charts show the returns. I believe that we are about here now between these two. We never got so bad as the one on the right. So if you look at the fertilization effects and the soil test level effects on the returns to application, these are dollars per acre coming back when P is applied. So we see that when we are very low, it doesn't matter much the price ratios, and there is a profits mostly when the fertilizer is applied to very low. When it is high or very high, it doesn't matter the price. When even here, we apply the removal rates for the high or very high. You see, it doesn't pay. And when we are in the optimum, that's when there are some questions, you see. In general, it's when the removal-based application to the soils that test optimums, on average, is about break-even. See, so farmers should not be afraid of not applying even removal rates for soil testing high or very high, as long as, of course, the soil test is right. Now, when we talk about water quality impacts, I borrowed this chart from my colleague and friend, John Downing. He works in the ecology, water ecology, things like that. And what we have here is the attribute. It is things that people can measure in the water, the lakes or stream. And this weird words at the top shows that that when we have 0 to 20 parts per billion of phosphorus, then we are all green. That means that all these things are kind of good, okay? As we increase the phosphorus levels in the water, some things get bad, okay? So if you look, several lakes, at least temporarily in Iowa, are between these two center ones, you see. So now, I don't like much fishing, so I don't care too much about sport fish, you know, and things like that, but some people do. So really, we don't need to be here in these high levels, okay? Now, when we talk about the forms of phosphorus that leave fields, we have essentially two major forms. We can classify in many ways, but one is dissolved P, okay? And the dissolved P that comes off from the land has the largest impact and the quicker impact on algae growth and water quality impairment, but often has short-term effects in streams and lakes with good water recycling. But this is when people look at the flare-ups, algae blooms, you know, mostly is the dissolved P. Now, the particular P, which is the phosphorus bound to the soil particle that initially is not actually soluble, but can become soluble, has a slower but a long-term impact in water quality. It has a variable effect depending on the receiving water body characteristic. For example, in Iowa shallow lakes, the particular P, the soil, the phosphorus bound to soil particles has a major impact. In deeper lakes, may not, you know, because that sediment may go to the bottom. So not much phosphorus comes out of it. Now, both the dissolved and the particular P fractions are considered by the Iowa P index, okay? Now, in the nutrient reagent strategy, especially because at the time, we didn't have much knowledge about here in Iowa, the North Central region, about what makes the dissolved P high or low. What we emphasize is the total P reduction, which I think is okay, you know, because by reducing the total P that is lost, hopefully we reduce both forms that come out of the fields. Now, people usually think about the soil test P because, okay, high soil test P, yeah, high risk of losses, and this shows that there is a linear relationship as the soil test P increases, then this is the soil P goes up. So really, we don't need to let phosphorus much higher than what is needed for crop. Now, things are not so simple, you know, because many things influence the amount of phosphorus that gets off the fields and the proportion of the dissolved P and total P loss. So we have all these processes here. You see, soil erosion, surface runoff. When we talk about surface runoff, we refer mainly to dissolved phosphorus coming off with surface runoff. And then, of course, then the subsurface drainage and so forth. So it's very complex, and that's why years ago, almost everybody in all states, we came up with the phosphorus index, you know, in order to put all these things together. The phosphorus index essentially which is at the core of the nutrient reduction strategy. I'm not going to talk about it, but just to remind you, we have these three major losses of phosphorus: the particulate P lost with erosion, the dissolved P lost with sulfate runoff, and mainly the one lost with tile drainage of subsurface drainage. Now, the size of these photos very roughly indicate what is the most important source mechanism for phosphorus loss on the type. See, we have usually the most is the loss with soil erosion. So we control soil erosion. We have a lot impact in reducing losses. And then we have what we call the source factors that influence the soil TP, the application method, the time and rate, etc. And then the soil conservation practices. So all these things come together. Now, when we are talking about conservation practices impacts on phosphorus loss, we have the rotation of row crops with forages. That's one. Control erosion, reduces losses. Contour or strip cropping, conservation tillage, no tillage, strip till, cover crops, grass waterways, buffer strips, and then soil erosion control, like terraces, things like that. Now, I'm going to talk just today about mainly no-till versus tillage and the cover crops. So the first thing I'd like to show is it's important before we get to the cover crops. We need to understand a few things that are going on when we get to tillage and we apply P or manure there. So this is an experiment that we have several studies there, but the first one were 6 years. We in Northwest Iowa, we have these large plots that we collected runoff, and we compared, no-till or tillage. Okay, the no-till. Of course, the no-till and the tillage is foil chiseled plow, disc of corn stalks, and then an only spring disc for on soybean ground. So, and the main objective was to see what happened when we attempt to maintain an optimum soil test level by applying the rate for the corn solvent rotation once before corn. Okay, that's what we did. And then by applying either broadcast P fertilizer or injected liquid swine manure. And this was a very interesting study. One of the first things that everybody suspected, but it's clear, and we have here data to confirm that, is that the impact of no-till or tillage is very different if we look at the soybean year or at the corn year. If you look here on the left, this is the soil loss, tons per acre, okay? So in the corn year, which means that the corn was planted on soybean residue, okay? So look at the level of the soil losses here, the gray bar, and then with no-till, there is a major reduction, in the soil loss in that year. But when we are in the soybean year, that means that it was planted on corn residue, then there is much less soil loss. And yes, there is an improvement with no-till, but it's not even close to be what happened in the corn year. Now, on average, then we see what is the impact. Okay, so this is no-till on reducing soil loss. Yes, we knew that it's good, but the main thing is when we have the soybean residue, that's when we need to make efforts to control soil losses. Then we have, this is a complicated chart, but we have the two in the left, the white graphs is when we apply twice the rate for the corn solvent rotation. The rate for the corn solvent rotation once before corn, and on the right in these bluish things, it's the same thing where we injected manure. Now we injected manure for both, for the no-till or tillage, and the broadcast fertilizer, of course, was incorporated in the fall with tillage, but not not with no till. So the gray bars is the total phosphorus. That includes everything that comes out. And the black is the dissolved phosphorus. See, we are actually focusing especially on dissolved phosphorus today. And the blue numbers is the proportion of the dissolved P of the total. For example, in this case with tillage, we see that the dissolved P is 20% of the total. With tillage, when we go to no-till, it's 54% of the total, okay? So this is something that some people don't like, and we're surprised. But we are finding that sometimes, not always, the no-till, yes, has a major impact in reducing total phosphorus loss, but can increase the proportion of the dissolved P of that phosphorus and also the total loss, you see. And then again, we see that the major impacts or benefits is in the corn year when we planted in soybean residue than in the soybean year, okay? And with injected soy manure is the same thing. Essentially, we don't see much of a difference. So with no-till, yes, reduce soil loss, reduce total P, but may increase the proportion or the amount of dissolved phosphorus that goes out. And this is the phosphorus that has most sooner and visible impact on water quality. Now, we work a lot over the years with this contraption. Years ago, I was, sorry, you can see I was younger there, but we went to many Iowa fields and then used rainfall simulation to look at a variety of things. One of the interesting things that we saw is that when we apply phosphorus to no-till, okay, no incorporation, and then we get a runoff event, say within 48 hours, there is a major difference in the phosphorus loss and the proportion of the dissolved P that is lost depending on the source, okay? So we have here no phosphorus. This is solid manure, beef cattle, poultry manure, solid, liquid soy manure, and fertilizer. We applied always 100 pounds on top of the soybean residue. We work in 21 fields. So you can see that overall, the main problem when we apply phosphorus to the surface, okay, all of these were applied to the surface. And then we get a runoff event, you know, large rain and loss, say within 48 hours of the application. The main problem is fertilizer. The second is soy manure, and then not as much for the solid manure. This is because of the form of phosphorus in the manure, but also the physical effect, you know, when the rain comes, what happened, extracting that phosphorus taken out from the field. But then you can see that the proportion of the dissolved P is much higher with liquid soy manure than with the solid manures, but especially how we fertilize. Okay, so we need to be especially careful, especially with fertilizer, when it is applied to the surface during a period where intense rainfall and runoff is very likely, which of course that happens usually in the spring. This is another experiment. This is injected soy manure, no, not injected, incorporated by disking or not incorporated. And this shows how the rate and the time to a runoff event influences the amount of phosphorus loss. The white graphs on the top is the dissolved phosphorus, pounds per 2.5 per acre, and the gray ones is the total phosphorus. That includes everything. So if you look here, when there is a runoff event within 24 hours of the incorporation, there is a huge higher loss increasing as the P rate increases when the manure is not incorporated. And the blue numbers is the proportion of that loss that is dissolved compared with the total P. When it is incorporated, then we have much less losses. But look what happened, and this is something that we've seen a lot. If the runoff event is delayed, in this case, the runoff was delayed about 2 weeks. Look at the major difference. See, essentially there is almost no difference between incorporation or not incorporation, except for the high rates of 100 pounds, and there was very small difference. This is the dissolved peat, and then 6 months later, we cover the plots. Okay, so this is not that the phosphorus was lost. It was that it was retained by the soil. There is now essentially no difference. Okay. Now, when we look at the total peat, we see about the same thing. So, yes, it's bad application to the surface of soil manure or even fertilizers when there is an immediate runoff event. This is important. You see. So this is another study that it's a different one. We work in 2 fields that we have a runoff on the left. We have a runoff event within 24 hours without incorporation into the soil. Runoff event within 24 hours incorporated by disking, and then a 10-day event later on without incorporation. So we see the same thing again. When we apply without incorporation, we get a runoff event soon. The losses with fertilizers are much higher than with liquid soil manure. And in this case, we didn't have beef solid manure, we have poultry manure. They are the lowest, okay? When we incorporate, we reduce those losses, okay? You compare the left chart and the center chart. It's obvious that incorporation reduces the losses. But when we look at the 10-day event, when it was not incorporated, actually, it was even better than the incorporation when we have a runoff event within 24 hours. So the importance of all this is that it gives clues about if we're gonna apply phosphorus, what happened depending on the probability of intensive rainfall and runoff. And from all this, it's obvious to me that it's very dangerous to apply, especially liquid soil manure broadcast or fertilizer in the spring when there is a high probability of runoff when it is applied over the surface, okay? When we apply it, say in the fall, before the soil freezes, then the soil tends to retain that phosphorus. And then when it comes spring, then it's not much loss. Here there is another example. This is for poultry manure fertilizer when it is applied in the fall before soils freeze, or when it's applied in early January, okay, in soil with frozen and with some snow, depending on the year. We work in 3 years, so the snow cover was kind of different. These are averages. But we see these are the losses again. This is poultry manure and fertilizer at 100 pounds. There is some losses, especially with fertilizer. And when it's applied in the winter, see that both the loss of dissolved P and total P are much higher for the fertilizer than for the solid manure. Now, in their infinite wisdom, I think it's DNR and RCS don't let you apply liquid soil manure in the winter, but you can apply manure and you can apply fertilizer. So, I mean, it is obvious. I mean, it's nice to apply fertilizer on frozen ground, but it's not a good idea. We really increase a lot the probability of phosphorus loss. Now, so the time between the P application and runoff event has a large impact on P loss, mainly with no-till, okay? Very important for fertilizer and liquid manure, but less important for solid manure, poultry or beef. So we must consider the probability of the runoff event in terms of how these things are applied. You see, it is very important, you see, and you need to be very careful when you listen to things coming from the Great Lakes, you know, like Ohio, Northern Ohio, or Ontario, because the conditions there are very different. In Iowa, it is much more safer to apply phosphorus in the fall before soil freeze, before snow, when it is applied to the surface, than not in the spring. Okay, because in the spring, yeah, you can have a dry spring, but the probability that when you apply something broadcast in the spring is that you may get, you know, 1, 2, 3, 4 inches of rain, and much of that will be lost. Okay, so the no-tiller conservation practices are especially beneficial with soybean residue. We saw that. There is poorer soil cover than with corn stalks. Okay, but most farmers don't like no-till before corn. Okay, now what should we do? In low testing soils, when P rates needed are high, yes, you can apply the 2-year rate for rotation before corn, but don't apply larger build-up rates. Many people do that precisely when the risk of phosphorus loss is higher, when we are applying to soybean residue. Okay, so it's better to broadcast the feed fertilizer and manure in the fall before snow or soil freeze, not in spring when rainfall intensity and runoff potential are very high. Now, bonding or injecting P below the soil surface could help, especially if it is done in the spring. Now, lots of time have been spent on research on the effect of cover crops on soil loss and mainly nitrate loss. So there is these cover crops can reduce soil loss, we know that, mainly due to the surface soil cover and often increase water infiltration too. Now, the Iowa climate and corn-soybean production systems limit cover crop options and growth compared with more temperate regions. Okay, we need to be very careful about it. Now, Iowa, Minnesota research has shown that the cover crops greatly reduce nitrate loss with subsurface type drain. That this is proved already. However, there was very little information from Iowa and the North Central region by cover crop effects on phosphorus loss with surface runoff. Okay, it should reduce sediment-bound P loss, because if it reduces soil loss, it should reduce the loss of phosphorus that is bound to soil particles. But then there is an uncertainty about effects on the soil P loss. So a few years ago, we started an experiment here in Iowa. That experiment I will show you before. But before we have 1 year or 2 of data, this result from a study in Kansas came about and created a huge hula in the North Central region, because they were showing that yes, the cover crops reduce erosion. I mean, you can see here 60 to 70% reduction, depending on the year. Of course, there were 2018, there was not much runoff, and it was more in 2016 there in Kansas. This is where they work. Now, the conditions in Kansas are different. They use the cover crops winter wheat in 1 year, then they use triticale with rapeseed in the other years, but it was corn-soybean rotation and no-till, okay? It was all no-till. Now, great, we are happy with the soil losses. But look what happened with the loss of phosphorus, okay? The total P, okay, the brown is the no-cover crop, the green is with cover crop. See, in 2016, the cover crop reduced the total P loss. In 2017, well, it didn't do much, but in 2018, it increased it. This is the total P, okay? But then when Nathan Nelson and the collaborators look at the dissolved P, okay, the cover crop increased the dissolved P loss in every single year. So some people were surprised. The explanation that Nathan gave to this result was that when the cover crop is terminated, there is much phosphorus, which is really soluble, that recycles into the soil. And that's in the spring when there is a high probability of rainfall. So essentially, it's like if you were broadcasting pounds of fertilizer there when that cover crop is terminated. That's the explanation that they gave to that. Okay. So about the same time, actually in 2014, we started work in a large project to look at the impacts of both no-till and cover crops here in Iowa. So we worked for 6 years, from 2015 to 2020, corn-soybean rotation with crops alternating each year. Often we have experiments that we have the 2 crops each year to get more information, but in this case, we couldn't afford that. And so we have the corn-soybean alternating each year. It was natural rainfall. This was in a farm, 42-acre field in southern Boone County. So we set up 12 small watersheds ranging from 1.5 to 3 acres. This is the slope, clarion soil. The soil test P was high and very high, and we maintain it high to very high with broadcast fertilization. And then the management until 2013, it was no-till corn-soybean rotation. So the treatments, the tillage were started in 2014. So there were four treatments, no-till, no-tillage with the cereal rye cover crop, tillage, and the tillage with cereal rye cover crop, okay? The phosphorus was the same all over the entire field. So we use a winter seeded rye cover crop, was overseeded before grain harvest of each crop. We use the Elbon variety, and we seeded a 2.5 bushel per acre rate. This is higher than is economic and recommended, but this experiment was extremely expensive. We wanted to be sure that the cover crop was well established there. And then was terminated with herbicide in the middle of April, okay? The tillage treatments were implemented since the spring of 2014, so 1 year before we started collecting runoff. And because of the cover crop, we decided to do no tillage in the fall, okay? So we had spring chisel plow and disc for corn residue, and only disking for soybean rest, okay? And this was done 7 to 10 days after the rye cover crop termination. This is just information about the soil when we started before the 2015 first year. So we had the obvious stratification. Here we have the braid in the soil. We have in the top 2 inches that was almost double phosphorus that if we measure in the 0 to 6 inches, but we can see that in the tillage, we was chisel plow was about the same. This is something that people are confused. They believe that the stratification accumulation near the surface happened only with no-till. That's not the case. It also happened with chisel plow and disking. Okay, so what do we measure? We measure the cereal rye cover crop biomass at its termination date, so the dry matter yield. We measure the above ground nitrogen and phosphorus uptake and recycle to the ground. I'm not showing anything about nitrogen today. Then we measure corn and soybean yield, and then we measure soil test P from different depths in the fall. I'm going to concentrate mainly in the impacts on runoff. So the ryegrass cover crop yield and P recycle were not affected by the tillage system. The rye growth, not ryegrass, I'm sorry, it's rye, cereal rye, not ryegrass. So this was the yield on average across all years of at the termination date. And on average, it recycled about 19 pounds per 2.5, okay, to the soil. Okay, the grain yields for 2020, I don't have them yet. I still need to work on the yield monitor file. But on average for the 5 years, no-till reduced both corn and soybean yield compared with tillage. In corn, there was a 6% reduction without the cover crop and 16 with the cover crop. Soybean, 9% reduction without the cover crop and 15 with the cover crop. We have these are conditions that is managed like most farmers would do, trying to do the best thing, okay? Now, the use of the cover crop reduced corn and soybean yield too. Corn, 11% with no-till and 12 with tillage, about the same reduction. Now, soybean was much less, was with no-till, was 7%, but was 12% with the tillage. Okay, now let's look at the runoff. We have, as I said, 6 years. In 2020, there was no runoff. Last year, zero, nothing. Because if you remember, it was kind of dry earlier. And then when rain came, you know, the crop was already covered in the ground, so there wasn't runoff at all in 2020. Then the lowest runoff was in 2017. There was another dry year. So I'm showing some results just to show what happened in a dry year. Here on the left, we have the runoff flow. This is the water loss, okay? And we see that the cover crop didn't have much impact, but the no-till reduced the loss of water, the runoff, probably because the cover and the infiltration increased. This is the soil loss. Look at the major difference. Now look at the numbers, okay? 1/10 of an inch was the maximum flow, and the soil loss were just a few pounds, okay? But we see the things that we expected, see? The no-till really reducing a lot the soil loss, and the cover crop reduced the soil loss a lot with tillage and also with no-till, but the general amount of soil loss with no-till was extremely low. And this is the loss with runoff, okay? Pounds of P2O5 per acre. And I put in black the dissolved P loss, and in the gray is the total loss. Okay, now look at the numbers, okay? A fraction of a pound loss only, okay? But we see a couple of clear things. The no-till, with or without cover crop, reduce a lot the phosphorus loss, both forms, okay? We also see that the cover crop has a large impact reducing the phosphorus loss, both dissolved and total, okay, with tillage, and also with no-till, okay? So this was in 2016 and 2017. This is what we observed that was kind of different what my friend from Kansas was finding for some reason. Of course, the conditions are different. Now I'm showing the 2018. 2018 was very high rainfall. And we have here the same type of charts. On the left, we see the runoff flow, the water flow. Now look at the inches. You see, in the first year was a very, very low, half an inch. Wow, geez, sorry. Okay, but now in 2018 we have about 8 inches of water flow. You know, and then in this case it was clear. The only difference was that no-till, with or without cover crop, the cover crop with tillage reduced the water flow compared with tillage, okay? So all these things were about the same. The no-till and the cover crop in terms of reducing the flow. And with the soil loss, now we have about half a ton loss. We see again that the no-till reduces a lot, so maybe to 15–20% the soil loss. And the impact of the cover crop is much more in the tillage than in the no-till. Okay. Now, when we look at the phosphorus, we see that again it's kind of consistent. That we see that with tillage, okay, we have the largest losses of total phosphorus and dissolved P2. The cover crop with tillage reduces a lot the total P loss, okay, but much less the dissolved P loss. That's because it's also reducing the particulate phosphorus loss, the sediment bound loss. With no-till, the effects of the cover crop are much less. See, yes, with here it reduces the loss, the total P loss, okay? But with the dissolved P, there is not much of a difference. So when we average everything, now I took out the runoff in 2017 because it was essentially very little. And then, as I said, in 2020, there was no runoff. So what we show is essentially that what I mentioned that happened was consistent. Again, this is the average over 4 years, okay? This is runoff flow. We see that the main thing is that the flow is higher with tillage, and the no-till of the cover crops reduce it, but the major effect of the cover crops is with tillage, okay? Reducing the flow, not as much with the no-till. When we look at the soil loss, again, we see a huge impact of no-till reducing the loss of soil, but the effect of the cover crop was huge with tillage, okay, reducing soil loss, but not as much with no-till. And then when we look at the phosphorus, which is the main thing we're looking at, we do not find really what the Kansas research found. I don't know if it is because of the conditions were different. The soil test was high, we put it in the fall, so I don't know what the difference may be caused by. But we see again that the no-till, again, the gray is the total P, reduces, okay, the total phosphorus loss a lot. This is no-till, this is with tillage, okay? Then the cover crop reduces a lot the total P loss, but less, proportionally less, the dissolved P loss, okay? And then the no-till, the cover crop reduces a bit the total P loss, but not much the dissolved P loss. So what we found here is good news, okay? We found that the tillage reduces the loss of phosphorus, total phosphorus, and dissolved, in contrast to the other experiment that we have in West Iowa. We are still looking at those things. So this issue that the no-till almost always increase the proportion, the concentration in runoff, doesn't mean that the actual loss, that may increase the concentration, the no-till may increase the concentration, doesn't mean that actually the actual loss is increased because of the effect of the no-till in reducing water loss, okay, and runoff. But then when we add in the no-till, then there is much less with the cover crop, doesn't do much, okay? And the major benefit of the cover crop is with tillage. And yes, a little bit with the no-till. So in summary, in this 6-year study, no-till effects compared with tillage, okay? Let's look at that, okay? What the no-till did compared with tillage, both without the cover crop. Reduced soil loss by 77%, okay? Huge reduction. And water loss by 30%, the no-till. Reduced total P loss by 38% and dissolved P by 12%. Okay, so the main thing in this study on average was that the no-till reduced total P loss a lot and reduced somewhat, a little bit, the dissolved P loss, in contrast to what they found in Kansas. Cover crop effects with tillage, reduced soil loss 69% and water loss 43%, okay? This is cover crops with tillage. And then reduce the total P 51% and dissolved P 26%. So again, there is a major reduction for total P, but less for the dissolved P. With no-till, however, all the reductions were proportionally less, to a lower level and less proportionally. So reduced soil loss 29% and water loss 30%, but then reduce the total P 21% and dissolved P only 11%. Okay, so the main conclusion we have from the study is that no-till is good. Okay, it may increase the concentration of dissolved P in the runoff, but not necessarily the loss because of the effect of reducing water and soil loss. Okay, and then when we go to the no-till, is that we have the smaller effects. So the cover crops are much more useful with tillage than with no-till. That is clear. But as I said, the good news is that we do not see here the increase in dissolved P loss with no-till and cover crop that in the Kansas study were observed. So with that, I think we should have time for questions.